They've just missed all that gold I've just finished explaining. So here we go. We're going to start with a lecture. All right, so, oh, hang on, you can't see that, can you? Because I haven't shared my screen. That would also be helpful. Okay, so. All right, iterative approaches to practice. So this is the focus of what you're doing here with us this week and next week. And this is the focus of what I want to see in your blogs and in the work that you finally produce for assessment task 3. And when we're talking about iterative approaches to practice, by that I'm talking about what you're thinking about in your HSC body of work currently. So we're working with ideas you currently have, as opposed to trying to come up with something brand new that's not related to where you're sort of currently sitting. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to listen to an interview with the Australian artist Tim Nicholson. In particular, we're going to unpack this aspect of his show called Evening Shadows, but he's going to talk around, he's got sort of 3 elements going on in this exhibition of his. We're going to focus a little bit on this one, but we're going to listen to him talk about that first. So. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down to the video work. There we go.
Charcoal has this curious characteristic that as you draw with it, it comes apart. So the charcoal disaggregates at the same time that the image begins to assemble itself on the page. And so there's a funny game between an image coming together and the matter of the drawing coming apart. Drawing as a process is something that I do pretty much every day and enjoy and helps me to think, but it's also a way to approach other materials and other problems and questions in art making and beyond art making. There is a way to think about drawing as being somehow at the very other end of a spectrum, which has the monument as its extreme opposite. A drawing has a fragility and a precarity which a monument can never have, because a monument always wants both a sense of authority and a sense of fixedness or finality, but also because I think a drawing contains its own processes in very important ways. You always know how a drawing has come to be. If you look at a drawing, you can usually see every single mark that is made on that sheet of paper, whereas a monument is always seeking to efface its own processes. So there's something about those 2 polar opposites and what happens when you draw them into a relationship, which is a critical part of this exhibition. What is it that a monument would be if you brought to bear the logic of a drawing upon it? The exhibition is called Public Meeting, partly as a way to think about what it is to bring artworks together, that the act of exhibition making could be considered a kind of public meeting of objects or artworks. It's also true that that process of gathering things together is a quite important part of individual artworks in this show. And there are many works which in some way draw together disparate elements from different places into a kind of assembly or gathering. Comparative Monument Shalal begins with a very strange presence in the Australian War Memorial, which is the Shalal mosaic, an enormous and incredible 6th century Byzantine mosaic, which is regarded as one of the great mosaics of the Middle East, and which was discovered quite by accident by Australian soldiers near Gaza in 1917. It was brought back to Australia, stolen, you could say, to be one of the visual centerpieces of the Australian War Memorial, which by chance was conceptualized the very same week that the mosaic was discovered by Australian soldiers. The work Comparative Monument Shalal tries to imagine what it would be to repatriate that mosaic. What would it be to take it back to the hilltop where it was taken in 1917? And what does that act of imagining its repatriation say about us? But also, what does it say about the political changes that have occurred in that landscape since 1917, particularly for Palestinian people who live in that landscape? Evening Shadows began with an encounter at the Art Gallery of South Australia in Adelaide, seeing H.J. Johnson's painting Evening Shadows. And I remember, in a very strange way, I suddenly had the thought, because it shows an Aboriginal woman with a child crossing the Murray River, it reminded me of the Cumragunja walk-off. And I thought, what would it be to think that painting in relation to the walk-off, or to reinscribe it with that incredibly important historical event? My interest in the painting only grew when I began to research it, because I discovered the painting is not only the most popular painting in the Art Gallery of South Australia, it's not only their very first acquisition with an accession number of 1, it's also the most copied painting in Australia. And so one of the first processes in that project was to attempt to gather together as many of those copies as I could. Seeing H.J. Johnson's Evening Shadows, which has been loaned by the gallery, and that sequence of copies is a very strange thing. You tune into the differences and the elaborations, the omissions, the additions that recur through those copies. And of course, the way that you encounter those works as a frieze is through walking. And it's very important that that work is staged to induce that act, which is both shown in the painting and which is so central to the walk-off itself. What is it to walk as an act of resistance, as an act of making meaning, as an act which is actually quite connected to the act of drawing? One of the interesting things about being an artist is not just making the work, but making its context, how you exhibit work. And because this is a survey and it's in a very unusual space, a very large space, it was a chance to experiment and think about what it is to exhibit these works together. In the main space, there are 3 works which are shown as strata, which each make a frieze which runs around the entire space, and which you then encounter as a kind of layering in the experience of the work. And it's a way to experiment with the encounter with the work and how we read a work of art, how we make connections between different works of art. But it's also a way to make a work which is very horizontal against the verticality of the monument, and which induces the act of walking very, very strongly in the encounter with the work. It's always hard to know what to hope for in what people take away from the work. I mean, I often think about that question in terms of what I have taken away from other artworks, and that funny paradox that an artwork is something which is such an intense experience, which displaces the way that you read and think and see, but it also persists. Like when you see an artwork that is moving or affecting, it sort of stays with you for the rest of your life. And that, I mean, to hope for that is a lot, but I think that's what an artwork can do and should do, that it permeates the way that we experience the world and the way we act in the world for a very, very long time after we've experienced it.
Okay, so let's just talk through this particular aspect if you show the evening shadows. So can someone, so I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. Can someone tell me what was the iterative part of that, or what do you think was one of the iterative aspects of that particular part of his exhibition?
The constant repetition of the same artwork over and over again.
Yes, absolutely. Now, the interesting thing here is that we're looking at that issue of agency. and this is sits within your conceptual framework thinking. So I'm starting you off pretty early today, trying to get your brains thinking a little bit. So what did he do? Let's just unpack what he actually did here. What did he do with those paintings?
He noticed that they were the most copied one in South Australia, and he decided to take them all and put them in like a line to walk through them. I do have a question though. Could you say that that is ready-made art? Because he hasn't really created it.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. It is already made, but it's also this is where I wanted to talk to you about that, where the agency comes in. Where is the artwork in that repetition of all of those works? I know I'm trying to, how can I draw this? Rather than asking the question, I might say that when we look at that work where he has had the idea, he's seen this particular work in the Art Gallery of South Australia, and he's recognised that it triggered the thought towards this particular political act of the walk-off, which happened in the 1800s in Melbourne, in Victoria. And it got him, when he realised that it was the first work collected by the Art Gallery of South Australia, got him then thinking about the fact that it was copied many, many times by many other artists. Now, where does the kind of the artwork lie? Is it with the original artist? Is it with all of the other artists who have copied the work? Or is it with Tom Nicholson, who has gone, I'm going to bring these works together and create another dialogue around what this work is and what this work means? So what we're looking at here essentially is very much that coming from a conceptual place. It is the artwork as idea. So rather than, and this is what we're talking about a little bit today, we're unpacking the idea of iteration through both ideas. We're talking about it through material or technical practice. Excuse me. And this particular work is an expression of an artwork through idea in a very, very kind of postmodern way. He's appropriating a work by another person from another time that had a different context. And he's what we call, and I hope you've heard this word before, recontextualized that work in a completely different setting. So one of the things he talks about in that video is the fact that one of the things that we get to do as artists is we get to reimagine works when they are put into exhibition. And this is something that we'll talk about next week in our Curating Your Artwork lecture, your final lecture, but I want to touch on it today because in conceptual practice, in contemporary conceptual practice, one way that we can reconsider the way we read works is through the way we present works. And so in that particular work, what we're looking at is Tom Nicholson's reimagining of the work via its relationship to its iterations, which are all of those other paintings by other artists, and then how we as the audience read that when we're in the space. So what was one of the things, again, George, that he said about the works that the audience has to do?
Oh, I can't remember.
Sorry, I thought you mentioned it before. He says that by the very way the works are placed, you have to walk around, you have to walk through them. So you're actually reenacting the walk off by walking through. Like it's a symbolic act, you're not really doing it, but it's symbolically linking iteratively to what's the action that's happening in the painting. Does that make sense? So this is an example of a really fine work where there's a lot of different layers going on, both in the physical iteration of the work and the conceptual layering of the work. A really, really good one, and I wanted to open with that one today. The other thing that we also saw in there briefly that he didn't talk about specifically was, you know, the drawing he started working on that he introduces you to at the beginning? That drawing, or that series of drawings, are actually his drawing iteration of the painting. So if you notice, it was kind of like almost like it was a negative of the painting positives. The Aboriginal woman on the bank was white, so it was like a black and white photograph in the negative. So the idea of also of absence presence, which of course again layers over the top of that particular work or body of work within his broader exhibition. But it also shows that he is then iteratively engaging with the work and making a copy, if you like, of it as well. But it wasn't the entire painting that he made the drawing of. It was a section of it. It was like a cropped element aspect of the work. And what he did was he framed the walk-off. He puts her more centrally in that drawing so that it brings our attention back to the kind of focus of the narrative of the painting, which is of the walk-off. A lot of things in there. Does anyone want to ask me or question anything about that? Is it clear what I've just talked about in terms of that particularly rather complex one to get started with today? And this is what I'm sort of discussing. I know some of you have got more of a solid idea about where you want to go than others, and that's okay. But this is where I'm kind of trying to get you to think around, either conceptually or material technically, how you can push your practice into different spaces. All right, let's go back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so an iterative of practice to form might be an example of, for instance, if you are drawing and currently using graphite, you might consider drawing materials such as a coloured pencil, charcoal, or ink. Alternatively, you might want to consider the materiality of graphite itself and consider using graphite powder, a graphite stick, or liquid. Or one of the other things that that we can always think of as well with our materials is we can actually think of the power that sits within the object itself. So for instance, graphite is a naturally occurring material. What linkages could we make to graphite in the way graphite is extracted for drawing that could then become graphite as a material that expresses a political act or a social act? So, you can think about your materials and using your materials iteratively in ways that aren't just about material technical, but they're also about conceptually, how perhaps you can extend your material in a conceptual way. This very small excerpt we're about to look at now is another artist. This is an American artist called Tim Hawkinson. I've been a long fan of his practice because what he does is he can take everyday materials and really turn them into wonderful and extraordinary works that talk about his experience of being in the world. This is just a very short bit I'm about to show you about how his drawing and sculpture, this particular drawing and sculpture interrelates. So just bear with me for a minute while we have a look at this one. Oops, hang on, let's go back one. I didn't link it, sorry. That wasn't very clever. Let me do that now. Sorry about that, guys. All right, here we go. Tim Hawkinson. Sorry, I'm just waiting it to buffer along because we actually want to go along to 48 minutes.
It's something that emotes.
We'll start at about here.
Here to this.
I can't see your screen.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Valves, and then the water.
Where are you all? Sorry about that, guys. The joys of teaching online. Okay, here we go. Can you all see that now?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Is collected in these buckets. So I put in these little pie tins, which create sort of a resonator. Really give a nice loud drip. The signal originates with these gears. Each gear has a little knob on it, a little bump. Each gear also is paired up with a switch. a different switch comes in contact with the bump on the gear, and it gives it a different pulse. It's not even electronics. I don't know what it is because, well, it's wiring. I think what it is just making circuits. The copper tape represents all the different possible permutations of gears. Some of these pieces have become a little more complex, and they're trying to do more things. And then it's sent through, I think this here, those are the main aspects of the work that end up having problems and breaking down. So maybe I need to go back to school or actually take a course in it. I was just thinking of this sort of creature that was allowed to grow in a zero gravity environment, and now it's being hung out to dry. This form we have as a three-dimensional expansion of drawings that I was working on, actually using a drill to spin a pencil around. You can see that the pencil lead was spinning around, and I was able to open and close the diameter of the spin while it was in motion. So I was able to create drawings that were almost kind of reminiscent of intestines or worms. There's a certain freshness in a drawing where you're seeing something for the first time.
Okay, so let's just talk about that one for a second. So Tim Hawkinson's drawing. The thing that I wanted to draw your attention to in that one was a kind of a more simple way of thinking about how drawing and sculpture can be related and iterated. So the big drawing that you saw, I originally saw that in the MCA 15, 17 years ago. It was massive. It was meters and meters long. That one you saw in his studio, there was a much smaller version. This was enormously long. I had no idea how he made it at the time until I chanced across this video. And what I thought was really interesting is that when we look at that really big drawing, and he had done versions of it in pen, and by pen I mean like, you know, the one you write with, the kind of what we called, I used to call them biro growing up, but I think he called it a ballpoint pen. He had them in green and red. He didn't have the graphite drawing version of it there. It was just the pen ones. He did have the sculpture, but at the time I didn't make that immediate connection between the way he had used the drill to both make the drawing, but then also to make the three-dimensional work. So in that particular work of Tim Hawkinson's, and he's a wonderfully experimental artist. You can see his studio was almost like a lab of experimentations, always playing around with different materials. He's not frightened to go beyond what we expect to explore materials and processes in ways that we wouldn't normally. So that approach might resonate with one of you here. You might sort of think, hey, actually, what happens if I take myself out of the space, or I actually add an intermediary. So for Tim Hawkinson, the intermediary was the drill. So he had the pen attached to the drill to make the drawing, but he also used the drill to help construct the sculpture. So what could you put in the way that might also act as an interruption, if you like, in your iterative approach to your work. And that applies particularly, and I am guilty of this in my own practice, for those of us who kind of have a way of making that we either feel really confident with or we know really, really well and we know we can get a result out of. And so sometimes for artists who are in that space, and you might be one of those, throwing something in the way that forces a different outcome that you're not entirely in control of can be a really great way of thinking iteratively about your practice. Okay, so let's move on to our next artist. So our next artist is Cornelia Parker, we're going to talk about, and she's someone who is very good with thinking about content and concept. So, for instance, here with your pretty iterative approach to practice content, and using self-portrait as an example, you might consider other ways that self-portraiture can be expressed. So if you're making more straightforward works that deal with the face or deal with expressions on the face, you might think of, you know, extending that into something like a selfie, which can be shared or published instantaneously through social media apps like Instagram. But conceptually, of course, we also then have to consider the context in which that's being published, and that is the fact that it's immediate. It raises questions about agency. Who has that? Is it you, or is it the media app that, you know, essentially has the right to your images when you put them out there? Issues around privacy and the influence exerts on self-image. And when I was putting this together for you ahead of starting this course, I didn't anticipate that some of you would bring these ideas of social media up and its pervasiveness and the impacts and issues that it causes to around mental health. So, you know, again, this is that idea where we can think about the content that's sitting within your practice and think about how we can maybe push that into other places, which might then lead on to making other ways of making in your work through the ideas. And we're going to listen to Cornelia Parker talk about hers now. But of course, I've forgotten to link that one as well. So I'll do that now.
It's like dreaming. You need dreams.
Sorry, am I sharing that? Can you guys see that?
No.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Can you see that?
Yep.
Thank you.
And I think that's what art is. It's kind of, it has this function in society that if a certain amount of people do it, then it helps digest things.
For nearly 3 decades, British artist Cornelia Parker has captured the attention of the international art world.
She takes very ordinary things, you know, objects from daily life. She reconfigures them in these really quite strange and haunting and surprising ways. She's always asking questions about the world, the way we see things.
The largest ever presentation of Cornelia Parker's work is currently being installed at Sydney's Museum of Contemporary Art.
Well, this is earth that's laid underneath the leaning tower of Pisa for over 1,000 years until it's extracted by engineers to try and right the leaning tower. This earth, its removal has saved the leaning tower of Pisa from falling.
So this is actually 1,000-year-old dirt.
That's right. This is something that's very humble material that would have normally been thrown away, but I quite like the idea of it becoming slightly deified, you know, that it's got this presence in the room.
The elaborate works take several weeks to install.
There's probably about 7,800 pieces of earth in this particular work. That's our estimate at the moment. So probably 3,000 or 4,000 wires, every one individually threaded.
And an exhibition of this scale comes with other unexpected challenges.
Well, yes, we had to get a gun license to show some of these works, which I find quite funny actually, because they're completely unusable. I mean, one of these firearms is chopped up into chunks like a sausage roll. Another one has been rendered down in acid, so it looks like, you know, a row of metal filings. It's completely useless.
Growing up in the countryside of Cheshire, England, Parker had a tough childhood.
You know, bullying father and a schizophrenic mother, and a father who didn't allow me to play. I worked all the way through my childhood doing, you know, mucking out pigs and milking cows and doing all that stuff. But it was just the idea of not being allowed to play, or if I was playing, I'd have to sneak off and do it, that I think the idea of going to art school just seemed so attractive, because it felt like you were just playing. So that's why I ended up being an artist, I think.
One of Parker's most famous works is Cold Dark Matter from 1991, where she convinced the British Army to blow up a garden shed.
They were surprisingly keen. But when they got there, they blew up all kinds of things for us, just to show them what they could do. So I think they just didn't need much excuse for blowing things up at the time. You know.
What message were you trying to convey through that work?
At the time I made that piece, we were having IRA bombs going off in London, and I wanted to make almost like a diagram of it. So it was a way of trying to understand the forces behind something.
Parker's more recent piece, War Room, is created from the discarded rolls of red paper used to make remembrance poppies.
So in this room, I think there's something like 300,000 holes, and you know, there's many more lives lost than that. Yeah. But when you think of that, that's quite sobering. Just love this material because it sort of felt more resonant somehow. You know, it was about absence rather than presence.
In 2017, Parker was invited to be the UK's official election artist. Her job was to document the campaign from an artistic point of view.
Just was so fed up with, you know, Brexit, with Trump, with all the political things that are happening. And I thought, well, either I say no to this and I just kind of steam at home, or I engage and see if I can flush the demons out for myself.
One of her pieces involved flying a drone around the House of Commons and creating a mess of daily British newspapers. What was the reaction to that?
I think it was well received. I think that by cross-party MPs, you know, I think they just were wanting a bit of a relief from their suffering.
At age 63, Parker continues to be driven by curiosity.
You know, it's a very inexplicable world we live in at the moment, and I'm always trying to understand it in some kind of way. And I suppose that's what I've been doing with my work recently. You know, it's trying to unpick something that's a bit too hard to swallow.
Hi, I'm Lee Sales. Thanks for watching this story.
Okay, Lee Sales. Stop share. All right, so Cornelia Parker's now, it's not immediately evident where the iteration is in that, but one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about in Cornelia Parker is the fact that she is really, really good at conceptualizing what can seem like really difficult ideas, problems, concepts, both materially and also conceptually. Having seen that show in 2019, the work that you saw, the Red Room one, which had it looked like the kind of inside of a tent with the red paper hanging down. That was all individual paper that she had put together from these, when they cut out the Remembrance Day poppies that you may have seen, they wear them in Britain particularly, and the stamps. It was a way of kind of taking an existing material that had an existing purpose. So the purpose was to make cut the flower out to make these little brooches that go on Remembrance Day. But then you've got all of this waste, you've got all of this extra paper from the cut that that wasn't being used. So what she did is she actually went to the factory, collected all of that tape part of the paper cut to turn it into something which talked of the whole meaning behind why the poppies are there. So the field of the poppies, the red room, which is about the loss of the soldiers in World War One. So what she was linking the color red to was the poppies that have a symbolic meaning. She was linking that to the fact that we kind of think of war and death with blood, and so that, you know, that being in that space was a very visceral kind of feeling, but also to the fact that they are, all of the shapes of those poppies are negative shapes within the space, so the idea of absence. So what she did, her iterative, conceptual iterative approach to that was to take an existing form, which is the poppy, that has a known context in, particularly in Britain, where they're worn on Remembrance Day, and then recontextualized that paper and used it in a way that still talks about the original idea, but uses the paper to make a completely new artwork, which gets us to re-engage with that idea. So this is another example of an artist who is really good with iterations of concept, and she might be someone that you want to explore as one of your artists for your work, particularly those of you who may be coming from a kind of social political space in your practice. All right, so let's go back to screen sharing and to our lecture. Okay, so the next one we're going to have a look at is Del Catherine Barton. Now, some of you are probably very familiar with Del Catherine Barton. She is an Australian artist. She's won the Archibald Prize twice, and considering that only 10 women in the entire history of the 100 years of the Archibald Prize have won it, that means that, you know, that's quite a feat for someone like Del Catherine Barton. Again, I saw this exhibition down in the NGV in 2019, and one of the things that Del Catherine Barton does is she thinks about her practice in an almost iterative way. So one of the things about Del Catherine Barton is that she explores symbolic language of femininity and interweaving references to traditional folklore in the cosmos. It's grounded in self-referentiality. So where I might talk about an autobiographic approach to mine, hers is this self-referential, which is a similar thing. She draws from a euphoric emotional inner world and explores themes related to motherhood, sexuality, female experience and her emotions. And her practice is underpinned by an intuitive response to her inner world. That's the content that informs her practice. The forms that she uses to work across are drawing, painting, sculpture, printmaking, installation, video, collage, photo montage to realize her ideas. We're gonna listen to her talk about her practice and about how her use of materials is an iteration of the concepts that she's dealing with. So we'll go to that one now.
Laser Disco is my first major mid-career survey show. It's by far my largest show to date. The work that greets you as you walk into the show is a large series of photo montage works, the work that I've slowly resolved over 3 years. So that's exciting for me also. I was very excited about the idea of making my largest painting to date. And the title of the work is Sing, Blood Wings, Sing. I mean, I always work intuitively. I never overthink starting points. It's more a gesture or a compulsion or a sort of emotional hook. It's a total reimagining of the song Puff the Magic Dragon. It's a more recent version by Will Oldham, which is much deeper and much sadder actually. And it's a long-time studio companion for me, that song. It's also about, as adults, we need to remind ourselves not to lose our puff. I've replaced the male protagonists in the original version for female protagonists. My greater oeuvre always speaks to different ways of inhabiting a female body in all of its complexities. I'm currently living with my daughter who's 12 and at that very tender age where her awareness around her physicality and her way of being in the world is slowly changing. So I see this as being a coming of age work also. It's a really incredible experience being allowed to inhabit this space for 10 days, to paint the wall element of this work, which is called Inside Another Land. This work is another very, very personal work in the show for me, because the seeing webs I collaborated with my mother on, slowly building the webbed wall, the rainbow webbed wall behind it. It was very arduous and very labour intensive and took longer than we'd expected. I thought it was a brave move for my curator, Pip Wallace, to bookend the show with major works in new media that I'm not as well known for. The last work in the show is a short live action film called Red, which is the first time I've worked with live action. In terms of thinking about the sort of fierce archetypal mother, I thought immediately of the great Kate Blanchett. Even though all of my work is very personal and comes from a sincerely lived place, this is by far the most personal work that I've ever made. My beautiful mother, who is very much, an innate part of the fabric of my universe, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer just over 2 years ago. When she was diagnosed, it was already stage 4, so non-curative. One thing that I think as a creative I'm quite good at is turning personal pain and fear and difficult emotional states into creative expression. So as a part of kind of managing my grief and staying strong for Mum, I knew I wanted it to be my most ambitious sculptural work to date. The initial idea was to build the world's largest handkerchief to soak up all the oceans of tears for all departed mothers. And my hope was that Mum might be able to see the work. So when I thought about the sculptural beat being a shell, I was thinking about the fact that when we find shells, they're homes that are already empty. So this idea of absence. But the idea was that I would build her a wooden shell, almost like the idea of a boat that she can sail away with her handkerchief. So it's quite childlike too, and through the oceans of our memories and loss. And in choosing a timber to build the shell, I thought about Huon pine. And the only trees that you're allowed to work with are trees that have fallen into the river. So I sort of thought that was a lovely poetic beat as well. Again, another death beat. And then the final beat, I cast my hands. And again, that speaks to the title, At the Foot of Your Love, because it was just about this devotional gesture of farewell you and I love you.
Okay, so plenty to discuss on that one in a moment. The things that she, as I said, is really known for is her painting drawing, but you can see that she extends that across a wide range of media, but she's still thinking about those quite specific thematic approach to do with the female experience, particularly, and you can see, we can make allusions to what that shell looks like. She's here, there's the photo montage works that she's turned into a fabric. These are all, kind of, again, the flower as a symbol of often of femininity, the idea of the sexual organs of the flowers being displayed here and being displayed in places in the photo montage, which stand in for vaginas and breasts and all of those sorts of things. So she has a very rich practice which thinks iteratively about the ideas that she explores to do with that female sexuality, femininity, motherhood, the female experience, across a range of forms. And the last one that I want to show you is this one here. And of course, again, I've forgotten to link it because I'm a goose. So let's just do that now. And what this final one is in fact an excerpt from the video work that has Kate Blanchett in it, which was amazing viewing. And I just, as an artist, I thought to myself, well, imagine being at that stature that you could ask Kate Blanchett to be part of your artwork, and Kate Blanchett says yes. So here we go. I'll show you an excerpt of it. The film is all about mother, daughter, about being a woman. It's about the fierce protectiveness of the mother and, mother love. So here we go. Okay, let's just get out of that one. All right, so stop sharing for a moment. Bill Catherine Barton, anyone not aware of her practice before right now? Or did you all know her? I think she gets taught in a lot of schools nowadays. So when you had a look at Del Catherine Barton's one, then as I said, I've talked through a little bit about that, but one of the things that she's really good at, as I said before, is to explore her ideas through a range of materials rather than just sitting with the drawing or the painting. She's able to take those ideas and then to iterate them and extrapolate them through different materials. And that's where we're about to go now into the workshop. So does anyone have any questions in regards to what we've just had a look at? And does anyone want to make any comment about any of the artists that we have just explored? Anyone?
I will say on the second one, the poppy room, I thought it was interesting that she used poppies because like flowers are like a memento mori. So it's like almost just like death. It's like the whole room was just death, and it was just a bit eerie. Thought. Yeah.
It was, and being in the space felt that way when you walked into it. And again, this is that thing where, you know, I said yesterday about going and seeing shows. Because there's nothing like being in the space. It's one thing to see it on screen, but to actually be in it and in that kind of luminous redness that enveloped you in that space, it really was quite powerful as an installation. You know, simple in the idea that it being like a tent, but really powerful in once you were sort of inside it and kind of encased or entombed or enwombed in, you know, in that space. So a really powerful one. I'm glad you brought that up. Anyone else want to make a comment about any of the other artists we had a look at? No? All right. Okay, so let's have a little look about where we're moving to now. It's nearly 11 o'clock. So the next thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to have a look at iterative approaches to your practice, but this is going to be a whole class activity. So a little bit like your mind map yesterday, what we're going to do is you're going to take another piece of paper, or you're going to take your visual art journal, up to you. This time, though, I want you to put form and content, but the form or content that you're actually exploring, and try and pare it down. So let's sort of say what your primary one is. It might be drawing, or it might be painting, or it might be video work, or, you know, digital drawing, whatever it happens to be. Just kind of put that in the center of your form. I want you to have a primary one. And the same thing for your content. What's your kind of primary content that you're exploring? So I know I said yesterday to some of you that it could be your it could be that you have a kind of an umbrella approach, like globalization. That's a very big one. I want you to kind of try and bring it back in a little bit if you can, to sort of to make it a little bit more specific. So in your second one for content, put what that particular content is you're exploring, and see if you can come over with a couple of words maybe for that. Use yesterday's mind map as your guide. I want you to think of then 3 ways you can explore your form, materially and technically, and think back to the artist that we've just had a look at, and 3 ways that you can explore your content conceptually or theoretically. So I should probably also say how you might want to recontextualize your content in some way. So they're the 2 things. We're getting you to think about your form in 3 different iterations and your content in 3 different iterations. Then, for example, as I said before in the PowerPoint, if it's drawing, maybe colored pencil, charcoal, or ink, or maybe if it's graphite that you're using, graphite powder, a graphite stick, or liquid graphite. Or again, if we want to think about the power that's embedded within the material itself, what can we do to think about how we can talk about that conceptually, how we can think about graphite as a conceptual iteration. Same thing again with content. If you're using self-portraiture and you're doing it in more traditional ways, what if we think about the more contemporary approaches to self-portraiture, which is the selfie, social media, the questions that it raises about agency and privacy and exerts on image and so forth. So this is what I want you to do now. Once you finish exploring those 6 different approaches, and we are going to spend time, I do not want you to rush this thing. We're going to take a good 15 minutes now to sort of sit down and think about these things. And then what you're going to do when we've finished all of that, I'm going to break you into some groups and you're going to talk about it. And then from that, you're going to think of one approach to form and one approach to your content, and then pick one of those options that you've chosen, and then think about how you could develop it into an artwork. And so for that, I then want you to start building sketches or use collage or photo montage or a mood board, whatever works for you is what I then want you to do. So over this next hour, this is what we're going to do. But for the first 15 minutes, I want you to think and spend time really thinking about what it is that you now want to sort of those 3 primary ones. You might have more than that, but I want you to kind of narrow it down to 3. So 15 minutes, guys. I'm actually going to go and make a cup of tea while you do that, but I want you to stay online because after 15 minutes, we're going to break into groups and you're going to talk about it in small groups amongst others. All right. So I will be back in this space in a couple of minutes. I'm making a cup of tea. Any questions, anyone? No? All right, sweet. I'll see you in a few minutes.
I cut out when you were explaining what we're meant to do. So could you